Call them out, and we'll sit here. Aglaya's idea was a good one. Have you heard anything about this, Prince? She turned to Prince Shch. Of course I have, in your own house. But I'd especially like to have a look at these young men, Prince Shch. Replied. These are those nihilists, 33 aren't they? No, ma'am, they're not really nihilists. Lebedev, who was also all but trembling with excitement, stepped forward. They're different, ma'am, they're special. My nephew says they've gone further than the nihilists. You mustn't think to embarrass them with your witnessing, Your Excellency, they won't be embarrassed. Nihilists are still sometimes knowledgeable people, even learned ones, but these have gone further, ma'am, because first of all they're practical. This is essentially a sort of consequence of nihilism, though not in a direct way, but by hearsay and indirectly, and they don't announce themselves in some sort of little newspaper article, but directly in practice, ma'am. It's no longer a matter, for instance, of the meaninglessness of some Pushkin or other, or, for instance, the necessity of dividing Russia up into parts. No, ma'am, it's now considered a man's right, if he wants something very much, not to stop at any obstacle, even if he has to do 8 persons to that end. But all the same, Prince, I wouldn't advise you. But the prince was already going to open the door for his visitors. You slander them, Lebedev, he said, smiling. Your nephew has upset you very much. Don't believe him, Lizaveta Prokofyevna. I assure you that the Gorskys and Danilovs 34 are merely accidents, and these men are merely mistaken, only I wouldn't like it to be here, in front of everybody. Excuse me, Lizaveta Prokofyevna, they'll come in, I'll show them to you and then take them away. Come in, gentlemen. He was sooner troubled by another thought that tormented him. He wondered whether this whole affair now had not been arranged earlier, precisely for that time and hour, precisely with these witnesses, perhaps in anticipation of his disgrace and not his triumph. But he was much too saddened by his monstrous and wicked suspiciousness. He would die, he thought, if anyone should learn that he had such thoughts in his mind, and at the moment when his new visitors came in, he was sincerely prepared to consider himself, among all those around him, the lowest of the low in the moral sense. Five people came in, 4 of them new visitors and the 5th General Ivolgin, coming behind them, all flushed, in agitation and a most violent fit of eloquence. That one's certainly on my side, the prince thought with a smile. Kolya slipped in with everyone else. He was talking heatedly with Hippolyte, who was one of the visitors. Hippolyte listened and grinned. The prince seated his visitors. They were all such young, even such underage people, that one could marvel both at the occasion and at the whole ceremony that proceeded from it. Ivan Fyodorovich Epanchin, for instance, who neither knew nor understood anything in this new affair, even waxed indignant seeing such youth, and probably would have protested in some way, had he not been stopped by what for him was the strange ardor of his spouse for the prince's private interests. He stayed, however, partly out of curiosity, partly out of the goodness of his heart, even hoping to be of help and in any case to be on hand with his authority, but the entering General Ivolgin's bow to him from afar made him indignant again. He frowned and resolved to remain stubbornly silent. Of the 4 young visitors, however, one was about 30 years old, the retired lieutenant from Rogojin's band, a boxer, who himself used to give 15 rubles to petitioners. It could be guessed that he had accompanied the others out of bravado, in the capacity of a good friend and, if need be, for support. Among the rest, the first place and the first role was filled by the one to whom the name of Pavlishchev's son was attributed, though he introduced himself as Antip Burdovsky. This was a young man, poorly and shabbily dressed, in a frock coat with sleeves so greasy they gleamed like a mirror, in a greasy waistcoat buttoned to the top, in a shirt that had disappeared somewhere, in an impossibly greasy black silk scarf twisted into a plait, his hands unwashed, his face all covered with blackheads, fair-haired, and, if one may put it so, with an innocently impudent gaze. He was of medium height, thin, about 22 years old. Not the least irony, not the least reflection showed in his face. On the contrary, there was a full, dull intoxication with his own rights and, at the same time, something that amounted to a strange and permanent need to be and feel constantly offended. He spoke with agitation, hurriedly and falteringly, as if not quite enunciating the words, as if he had a speech defect or was a foreigner, though he was, incidentally, of totally Russian origin. He was accompanied, first, by Lebedev's nephew, already known to the reader, and, second, by Hippolyte. Hippolyte was a very young man, about 17, or perhaps 18, with an intelligent but constantly irritated expression on his face, on which illness had left its terrible marks. He was thin as a skeleton, pale yellow, his eyes glittered, and 2 red spots burned on his cheeks. He coughed incessantly, his every word, almost every breath, was accompanied by wheezing. A rather advanced stage of consumption was evident. It seemed that he had no more than 2 or 3 weeks left to live. He was very tired, and sank into a chair before anyone else. The rest made some show of ceremony on entering and were all but abashed, though they looked grave and were obviously afraid of somehow losing their dignity, which was strangely out of harmony with their reputation as negators of all useless social trivialities, prejudices, and almost everything in the world except their own interests. Antip Burdovsky, proclaimed Pavlishev's son, hurriedly and falteringly. Vladimir Doktorenko, Lebedev's nephew, introduced himself clearly, distinctly, and as if even boasting that he was Doktorenko. Keller, the retired lieutenant, muttered. Hippolyte Terentiev, the last one, shrieked in an unexpectedly shrill voice. They all finally sat down in a row on chairs opposite the prince. Having introduced themselves, they all immediately frowned and, to encourage themselves, shifted their hats from one hand to the other. They all got ready to speak, and they all nevertheless remained silent, waiting for something with a defiant air, in which could be read, "No, brother, you're not going to hoodwink me." One could feel that as soon as any one of them began by simply uttering a single first word, they would all immediately start talking at the same time, rivaling and interrupting each other. 8. Gentlemen, I wasn't expecting any of you, began the prince. I myself was sick till today, and as for your business, he turned to Antip Burdovsky, I entrusted Gavrila Ardalionovich Volgin with it a month ago, of which I then informed you. However, I am not avoiding a personal discussion, only, you must agree, at such an hour I suggest that you come with me to another room, if it won't take long. My friends are here now, and believe me, friends as many as you like, but nevertheless, allow us, Lebedev's nephew suddenly interrupted in a rather admonitory tone, though all the same without raising his voice very much, allow us to declare to you that you might treat us more respectfully and not make us wait for 2 hours in your lackey's quarters. And, of course, and that's prince-like. And that, it means you're a general. And I'm not your lackey. And Antip Burdovsky suddenly began muttering in extraordinary excitement, with trembling lips, with an offended trembling in his voice, with spit spraying from his mouth, as if he had all burst or exploded, but then hurrying so much that after a dozen words it was no longer possible to understand him. That was prince-like. Hippolyte cried out in a shrill, cracked voice. It have happened to me, the boxer growled, that is, if it had a direct relation to me, as a noble person, then if I was in Burdovsky's place, I. By God, gentlemen, I learned only a moment ago that you were here, the prince repeated. We're not afraid of your friends, prince, whoever they may be, because we're within our rights, Lebedev's nephew declared again. What right did you have, however, if I may ask, Hippolyte shrieked again, now becoming extremely excited, to present Burdovsky's affair for the judgment of your friends?